Die Völker werden in kurzer Zeit erkennen, dass das nationalsozialistische Deutschland keine Feindschaft mit anderen Völkern will. Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Adolf Hitler made no secret of his ultimate ambition. The Soviet Union wasn't merely an adversary, it was his obsession. He despised Bolshevism with a visceral hatred, and he coveted the endless steppes and untapped riches of Russia as the living space that would transform Germany into an unassailable empire. Through the early months of 1941, secluded at the Berghof, his mountain retreat high in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler refined his most audacious gamble yet. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Methodically, his armies repositioned eastward, receiving fresh equipment for what would become their supreme test. Officially, Stalin's Soviet Union remained Germany's ally under their 1939 pact, and Stalin was desperate to maintain that fiction. His country was catastrophically unprepared for war. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided, by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. The Red Army, once the world's largest and most technologically sophisticated fighting force, had been gutted by Stalin's paranoid purges of the late 1930s. Three-quarters of its senior officer corps had been executed or sent to the Gulag. Beneath the impressive parades and propaganda, morale had collapsed. Combat effectiveness had cratered. As German divisions flooded into occupied Poland, Stalin, frantic to preserve peace, issued strict orders. Do nothing to provoke Hitler. But Hitler had unfinished business before striking east. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were reliable German satellites. But in March 1941, Yugoslavia's pro-German government was overthrown by officers sympathetic to Britain. Neighboring Greece was also aligned with London. On April 6, 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded the Balkans. 33 divisions smashed into Yugoslavia, shredding its defenses. Belgrade capitulated on April 12th. Greece collapsed almost as swiftly. Despite British reinforcements, Athens fell in under 3 weeks. The road to Russia was now clear. Over 4 million men would be hurled eastward. More than 3,000 aircraft would darken the skies above them. The plan called for 3 simultaneous hammer blows. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center would drive straight for Moscow. Army Group South would conquer the breadbasket of Ukraine. Hitler's generals fell silent when presented with the plan. They recognized it was dangerously ambitious, stretching their forces perilously thin across a 1,800-mile front. But none dared voice their doubts. The Red Army dwarfed them in raw numbers. Nearly 2 million Soviet troops stood within striking distance of the frontier, with millions more in reserve. The Soviets also possessed over 20,000 tanks, outnumbering Germany's 6,000 by more than 3 to 1. Though largely obsolete, they remained a formidable mass. The critical question, could German technological superiority and lightning speed overwhelm the Russians before sheer Soviet numbers ground them into dust? Operation Barbarossa exploded at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. The Luftwaffe struck at dawn, obliterating Soviet airfields caught with planes lined up wingtip to wingtip. Simultaneously, the ground assault began. German forces stormed across the Riverbug, the border between occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers were soon slicing deep into enemy territory. Within 48 hours, they had penetrated over 50 miles. Disorganized Red Army counterattacks were brushed aside like insects. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers stumbled into captivity. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe achieved total air supremacy. The Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed, frozen by the scale of the German onslaught. On June 29th, just 7 days into the invasion, 2 panzer thrusts linked up near Minsk, encircling vast pockets of trapped Soviet forces. As follow-up infantry arrived to seal the ring, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken. Often, the Germans found themselves greeted as liberators, particularly in Ukraine, where anti-Russian sentiment ran deep. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to suffer a near-complete breakdown at his betrayal by Hitler. He retreated into silence for over a week, not addressing his people until July 3rd, when he finally appealed to their patriotism to save the motherland. In Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received news of Barbarossa with very different emotions. It meant his island nation no longer stood alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was now a friend of Britain, regardless of past political differences. He dispatched a mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance treaty with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But beyond sending convoys of supplies by the perilous Arctic Sea route, there was little Britain could do immediately to help the beleaguered Soviets. As June turned to July, the German blitzkrieg carved ever deeper into Soviet territory. It appeared nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first catastrophic strategic error. In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army troops were encircled west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, particularly the aggressive General Heinz Guderian, pleaded to be unleashed eastward. Barbarossa was unfolding like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers had reached Smolensk, deep inside Russia, barely 200 miles from Moscow. On July 22nd, a pincer movement snapped shut east of Smolensk, trapping another 310,000 Soviet soldiers. Here came a brief operational pause while the rest of the army caught up. The tanks could sprint at spectacular speeds, but the bulk of the Wehrmacht still marched on foot or relied on horse-drawn transport, just as Napoleon's army had 130 years before. Still, it took only 5 days for the infantry to arrive and begin the systematic reduction of the pocket. The operation was completed in 9 more days. Endless columns of Soviet prisoners began the long march westward into captivity. Over 2.5 million would never return. Moscow now lay just 200 miles distant. The road lay open. Its fall by summer's end seemed certain. But elsewhere, the German advance was encountering stiffer resistance. The Red Army was counterattacking with increasing effectiveness. By mid-July, Army Group South remained more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler made a fateful decision. Guderian's panzers would halt their advance on Moscow and wheel south to assist the capture of Kiev. Guderian protested vehemently, but Hitler was immovable. There would be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. It would prove to be a decision with devastating consequences. Already, troubling signs were emerging that the Red Army would not collapse as Hitler had expected. Soviet manpower seemed inexhaustible. Over 16 million troops were now mobilized, and the Red Army was fielding formidable new weapons, in particular, a revolutionary new tank, the 37-ton T-34. Armed with a 76mm gun, it was faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to Russian terrain than Germany's Panzer Mark IV. Yet amid the continuing blitzkrieg successes, these warning signs were easy to overlook. Guderian's panzer group began its southward thrust on August 23, 1941. 3 weeks later, the panzers of Army Group South struck northward. The pincers met east of Kiev on September 16th. 2 more Soviet armies were annihilated. 500,000 men, killed or captured. On that same day, 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North completed its encirclement of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. The city was immediately severed from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was besieged. Hitler chose not to storm it. Instead, German troops would starve it into submission. Conditions inside became apocalyptic. The only lifeline to the outside world was across Lake Ladoga to the east. But only a trickle of food could reach the city by water. Starvation took hold. Over 11,000 people perished in November alone. Not until December could an ice road, the Road of Life, be opened across the frozen lake, allowing a slight increase in rations. But on one December day alone, 3,700 people died of hunger. Meanwhile, Army Group Center prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had rejoined it to spearhead the attack. The Germans enjoyed a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the point of contact, and 3-to-1 in aircraft. The assault, Operation Typhoon, launched on September 30th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers sliced through the Red Army. By October 7th, yet more Soviet forces were encircled. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last man. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov, his most capable commander, to organize the capital's defense. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig concentric rings of defensive positions. But the real obstacle to the German advance would be the weather. On October 8th, heavy autumn rains began. German vehicles soon became mired in a sea of bottomless mud, the infamous Rasputitsa. By late October, appalling conditions and increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance had stalled Army Group Center some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was now paying the price for his earlier decision to divert forces to Kiev. Around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet forces. Another 100,000 prisoners were taken, but they too were hampered by deteriorating weather. Even so, the city of Kharkov was captured on October 24, 1941. Then the weather shifted from mud to bitter cold. German forces, confident the campaign would be over before winter, had brought no cold weather gear. Now they suffered terribly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center launched its final desperate push to capture the Soviet capital. By December 4th, leading German units had fought to within 19 miles of Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting on the horizon. But that night, temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees. Tank engines refused to start. Weapons seized up. Thousands of soldiers suffered severe frostbite. On December 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had saved the Red Army, but the Germans remained confident that come spring, they would finish the job. Throughout autumn 1941, Stalin's armies had reeled under the German hammer blows. But all the while, the Soviet dictator nursed another fear: that Japan would attack his forces in Siberia, opening a catastrophic second front. Then in November, his master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, sent word. The Japanese had no intention of attacking. They were looking south, toward the Pacific. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway. These were elite troops, well-equipped, fresh, and trained for winter combat. By early December, over 500,000 additional men had reached positions near Moscow. On December 5th, the very day the Germans abandoned their assault, the Red Army struck back with savage fury. First came a massive Soviet artillery barrage. Then swarms of T-34s crashed through the frozen German lines. Stunned by the ferocity of an enemy they believed was finished, the Germans fell back in disorder. For 7 days, Soviet forces tore into the Wehrmacht. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, it was a devastating blow. On December 19th, Hitler dismissed his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed personal command of the German army. Heinz Guderian was also relieved, along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now issued his infamous stand or die order. There would be no further retreats. German troops would fight, and if necessary perish, where they stood. It worked. The German line gradually stabilized. But Stalin, intoxicated by success, now demanded a general offensive across the entire front. Marshal Zhukov tried to dissuade him. The Red Army was exhausted, its logistics stretched thin, but Stalin would not be denied. For the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around German defensive positions. The broad offensive achieved little. For Hitler, this was an unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable situation. He was accustomed to quick, decisive victories. Now he was dangerously bogged down in Russia, facing an enemy that simply refused to quit. And Russia wasn't his only problem. On December 7, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Hitler, with almost no strategic calculation, declared war on America. Without planning or preparation, he had taken on a vast new enemy with limitless industrial capacity. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to resume the offensive. But he needed a new approach. The original plan of attacking across the entire front was no longer feasible. Moreover, his economic advisors delivered alarming news. Germany's oil reserves were running dangerously low. So Hitler decided to halt operations in the north and strike south, toward Russia's oil fields in the Caucasus. The plan for Operation Blue called for an assault south of Kharkov. Army Group A would swing down to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B covered its northern flank along the River Don. First came a brutal encounter with Soviet forces attempting to recapture Kharkov. Another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured. 70,000 were killed. Simultaneously, the Germans tightened their stranglehold on Sevastopol in the Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders had endured constant bombardment, including from Schwerer Gustav, a monstrous 800mm railway gun. In late June 1942, Sevastopol finally fell. The southern flank was now secure for the drive to the oil fields. On June 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way to the River Don and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A faced stiffer resistance, but by July 9th was approaching Rostov, the gateway to the Caucasus. Then Hitler made a series of catastrophic interventions. As Army Group B advanced along the Don, the Führer ordered it to capture Stalingrad, a city of no immediate strategic importance. The army had suddenly been handed a massive new objective. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his error. Frustrated by slow progress in the Caucasus, he diverted the bulk of his panzers southward into the mountains. The advance on Stalingrad slowed noticeably. The reinforced Army Group A now raced across the Caucasus, reaching within 70 miles of the Caspian Sea, threatening to sever all Soviet forces in the region. Then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's sluggish progress toward Stalingrad, he ordered the panzers back north. On August 9th, Army Group A seized the first southern oil field at Mykop. They found it comprehensively sabotaged, every well destroyed, every facility wrecked. Without reinforcements, they could advance no further. The vast oil fields of Central Caucasus and the Caspian remained tantalizingly beyond reach. But Hitler's attention had already shifted. By late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city bearing his arch-enemy's name had begun. It would become one of the most decisive battles in human history. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don and began its final push on Stalingrad. 6 days later, one panzer thrust had reached the Volga just north of the city. German forces were fighting in the outer suburbs. Hitler seemed poised for a symbolic triumph that would humiliate Stalin before the world. Stalingrad was a vital industrial center, a city stretching over 12 miles along the western bank of the Volga. Its factories produced a quarter of all Soviet tractors and trucks, along with tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The Russian people had transformed it into a fortress. They had been helped by Hitler's earlier decision to divert panzers southward, buying them 2 precious weeks to prepare. The German plan was brutally simple, a direct frontal assault. What followed would be one of the longest and most savage battles in the history of warfare. Slowly, the Germans clawed forward, street by street, block by block, with Stuka dive bombers pulverizing everything ahead of them. The fighting was merciless. House to house, room to room, hand to hand. Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communication, the shattered ruins above for sniping. Russian reinforcements had to be ferried across the Volga under constant air attack. Often they were slaughtered in the water, but thousands still got through. By late September, the Germans had fought their way through most of the city, almost to the Volga's edge. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad had become an obsession that overrode all strategic logic. On October 4, 1942, General Paulus launched what was intended as the final assault. Tanks led the attack, grinding over rubble, firing point-blank into courtyards and cellars. One German officer wrote, "We measure our advance in corpses, not meters." German victory seemed inevitable. But in fact, the Germans were dangerously overextended. their flanks held by poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops stretched thin along the Don. By mid-November, the Soviet High Command had secretly assembled massive forces. Over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, more than 1,000 aircraft, all moved into position with extraordinary stealth. On November 19th, they struck the German northern flank. After a pulverizing artillery barrage, waves of T-34s and assault infantry smashed through the Romanian positions. Now it was the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. The next day, a Soviet assault in the south was equally devastating. On November 23rd, the two pincers met west of Stalingrad. The German 6th Army, nearly 300,000 men, was encircled. General Paulus could have attempted an immediate breakout, but Hitler ordered him to stand fast and fight. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring had assured the Führer that sufficient supplies could be airlifted into the pocket. This was enough for Hitler to decree that the 6th Army would hold its positions until relieved. To rescue Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding all German forces in the region, launched Operation Winterstorm on December 12th. It was an armored thrust to break the Soviet ring. For 2 days, the panzers made progress. Then Red Army resistance stiffened. By December 23rd, the relief force had ground to a halt, still 30 miles from the city. Manstein urged Paulus to attempt a breakout toward his approaching forces, but Paulus wanted Hitler's permission first. It was refused. By then, it was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov now unleashed the next phase of his master plan, a massive assault on the Panzer Relief Force itself. The panzers were driven back, away from the city. By the end of December, all hope of relieving the 6th Army had evaporated. Worse still, the airlift was a catastrophe. German troops inside the pocket needed 700 tons of supplies daily to survive. They never received more than 80. The weather was too brutal. Soviet fighters now ruled the skies. Steadily, the Red Army squeezed the encircled Germans. 200,000 men were trapped. On January 8th, the Soviets called on the Germans to surrender. They refused. On January 31st, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Paulus surrendered. Over 91,000 men, frozen, starving, broken, stumbled into Soviet captivity. Only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad had been an epic slaughter. The Germans had lost approximately 300,000 of their own men, plus at least as many from their allied armies. Soviet losses were comparable, including countless civilians who perished in the inferno. It was Germany's greatest military catastrophe of the war thus far. But it would not be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting devastating defeats across the entire Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a triumph for the Soviet war machine. Now Marshal Zhukov set his sights on Army Group A, still stranded deep in the Caucasus. Soviet forces thrust westward from Stalingrad, and by early December 1942 were within 120 miles of Rostov. There was a real danger that every German soldier in the south would be cut off and annihilated. With no alternative, Hitler reluctantly authorized Army Group A to withdraw. Over the following month, the Germans conducted a skillful fighting retreat. Hundreds of thousands of troops escaped the trap. Then, on January 12, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out offensive. The Soviets attacked along a 500-mile front. Outnumbered 7-1, Field Marshal von Manstein fought a brilliant mobile defense. But by late February, the Red Army had liberated both Kursk and the nearby city of Kharkov. This winter offensive had struck a crippling blow to German power. In mere months, the Wehrmacht had lost over 1 million men, along with vast quantities of irreplaceable tanks, guns, and aircraft. The Red Army still commanded enormous reserves of manpower. It was also benefiting from a massive surge in domestic weapons production and a flood of aid from the United States and Britain: trucks, aircraft, food, and raw materials. The Germans no longer held the technological edge. The T-34 was now more than a match for the Panzer IV. And the Soviets had developed the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, its screaming salvos shattering German morale. Yet Hitler refused to accept defeat. He still dreamed of a preemptive summer offensive that would throw the Soviets off balance and reclaim the initiative. The city of Kursk seemed the obvious target. Here, the Soviet winter offensive had pushed a bulge, a salient, deep into German lines. It looked temptingly exposed. Hitler decided this bulge should be pinched off and the forces within annihilated. He also had a secret weapon. The German counterattack would be spearheaded by a new generation of tanks designed specifically to combat the T-34. The massive Tiger tank, 55 tons of steel, mounted a lethal 88mm gun. Its thick frontal armor made it virtually impervious to Soviet tank guns. Then there was the faster Panther, 43 tons, armed with a new long-barreled 75mm gun, also capable of destroying a T-34 at long range. These tanks were so new that Hitler was forced to delay the offensive while sufficient numbers rolled off the assembly lines. But even as German forces assembled, Marshal Zhukov had already deduced what was coming. Soon afterward, Soviet intelligence, including a spy inside German high command, confirmed both the target and timing of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of the most elaborate defensive system in military history. Anti-tank ditches, minefields 8 miles deep, multiple defensive belts bristling with guns and fortifications. He also massively reinforced the salient, drawing troops and armor from across the front. By the eve of the assault, the Germans were vastly outnumbered by defenders who knew exactly when and where the blow would fall. On July 5, 1943, just as German troops prepared to attack, they were hit by a massive Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning, the panzers rolled forward. But this time they faced a deeply entrenched enemy fighting from prepared positions. There would be no lightning blitzkrieg breakthrough. The results were catastrophic. In the north, the German army gained just 6 miles, at a cost of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans fared slightly better. They drove a wedge 25 miles into the Soviet defenses. But the price was staggering. 10,000 men killed, 350 tanks destroyed. For a fleeting moment, a German breakthrough seemed possible. Then Zhukov committed his reserves. On July 12, 1943, 900 Soviet tanks charged into the German flank near Prokhorovka. Nearly 2,000 tanks clashed in what became the largest armored battle in history. The Soviet T-34s drove into the German formations at close range, negating the Tiger's advantage in firepower and armor. After a single day of apocalyptic combat, the Germans had lost 350 more tanks. They were retreating. Meanwhile, overhead, an epic air battle raged. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force established superiority over the Luftwaffe. Now the Russians could unleash their fearsome Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, the flying tank, against German armor. By July 23rd, the Germans had lost every inch of ground they had gained, along with the elite of their panzer forces. Hitler's gamble at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and over 700 irreplaceable tanks. Never again would Germany launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The tide of the war had turned, irreversibly. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dive every week. Thanks for watching.